But you have to come from down in Jersey.
It's
right?
quite a drive, but I came up last night actually because
Okay,
I
good.
met with some people at
I think you're in
WBAI.
New York a lot, right?
I was in New York 4 days this week,
There
so
you
it's
go.
like nothing. I go back
Maybe
and
you
forth.
should just come move to New York.
Well, I'm trying to. My problem, I'm going to move to North Jersey, but the problem is my daughter taking her out of school and away from her friends and the neighbors and all that. You know, that's the main reason I'm down there right now.
Well, I want to hear about what you're doing down there because I know you're doing some adjunct teaching.
Yeah.
And welcome very much to our conversation. Pleasure
Thank
to
you.
welcome to the program a guest who's been here before and will be well known to those who tune in to WBAI. That's Sharin Chiorazzo. And you have a program there, live from Palestine.
Yes, I do.
And as I understand, you are a Middle East analyst. Teach a course in that as an adjunct
That's correct.
in the New Jersey college system.
That's
and
correct.
you were the fiance of a dear friend of mine, Farouk,
Yes.
who just recently passed. All of this, I'm sorry about that.
Well, thank
but
you.
welcome very much to conversation. We're going to want to learn about Palestine and things that are going on. But thanks a whole lot for coming in. It's a great pleasure to see you again.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Harold. And yeah, I really do appreciate it. And unfortunately, Farouk's demise was it's not so recent anymore. It's now a year and a half.
Is
well,
it that long?
It'll be 2 years this July 21st.
Remember the day he got out? I remember when he got out. They had
course.
that thing with Amy Goodman down at the, what is that place? On Astor
Cooper
Square?
Union, the Great Hall.
Cooper Union, Great Hall.
The Great Hall with
I saw him
Tim
there. I didn't
Robbins.
even know he was out. He was there, and then we embraced like
Yeah.
lost long brothers. And he
She
was a
had-
great friend of Harriet Karchner's.
Yes, I knew
and the
Harriet
new
very
tour.
well.
Wasn't she lovely?
I loved Harriet.
I loved Harriet Karchner.
Been to
We're
her house many
reminiscing about
times.
old times. We know we have a lot of mutual friends.
Yes, we do.
And I wonder, maybe you could. We got a whole lot, 58 minutes. We got a little piece of tape I know we're going to show and everything. Maybe you could share. Why don't you, if you could, share some of your background, just in a thumbnail kind of way. And then we want to talk with you about your special understanding of things as far as Palestine and the recent bombshell of the election victory by Hamas and so forth. But could you share some of your own background, please?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, I did want to just clarify that, yes, I do teach an adjunct course at Richard Stockton College of New Jersey.
Okay.
It's a course that focuses on nationalism in the Middle East.
Okay,
It's
big
called,
subject, yeah.
Yeah, it's called Nation, Democracy, Modernity. So it really focuses on nationalism and its implications for democracy in the modern world, because that's like really kind of a loaded phrase, and I kind of deconstruct and analyze and look at that from many different directions, especially the way nationalism has had its effects on parts of non-Western parts of the world, the Middle East in particular.
Huge subject, if I may suggest.
Huge subject. But yeah, I was born in New Jersey from Italian parents, and basically had a very normal, you know, American upbringing, but got very interested in the Middle East because I used to like to, you know, try to figure out what these biblical texts said and whatnot.
Why?
And
Were you involved not in the church or anything like that?
Well,
or
I was
really?
Catholic, but I mean, I didn't think we learned very much.
Serious
in the Catholic?
Catholic? Or
No, I mean, just like, well,
Yeah.
you know, going to CCD and going to church and cutting church and using our money in the 7-Eleven and things like that, you know. But I really didn't get much out of it. So when I was 12, after my confirmation, I excommunicated myself from the Catholic Church.
Wait a minute, you didn't really, you just sort of went away.
I just sort of said, this is not for me, you know what I mean? And then just, you know.
The church.
Yeah, but I did do a lot of reading, and I was very interested in the Holy Land, so I, you know, in 1985, I went there. I wanted to go in 1982 as a part of an overseas program at Stockton, because Stockton is my alma mater. I'm an alumnus of Stockton, Richard Stockton College.
And did you study Middle East history or something?
No, I studied communications, but I did take one course on the Arab-Israeli conflict there, which totally, I would be able to almost diffuse and refute everything the guy ever taught us about, but, you know, at this point, because it was taught from a very Zionist point of view and a very limiting point of view, which they still teach it that way in most colleges.
Really?
Yes, they still do it that way. And I have an ongoing argument with a guy there that teaches the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I constantly refute, you know, most of the things that he says, because he leaves the whole Palestinian question out of it, makes them look like a bunch of terrorist savages and uncivilized, and uses all these, you know, Orientalist arguments to deconstruct and delegitimize their struggle.
Isn't that been part of what a lot of the colonial powers did over the last 500 years or so since Columbus?
Absolutely.
It was a matter of European colonialism that only seemed to end after the, in major terms, after the Second World War, with the possible exception of the of the movement into Israel by the Ashkenazis, it seems to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the colonization has still not ended because actually Israel is a colonial settler state, or a remnant of it by all means, and it's really the last colonialist bastion in the world. But that doesn't negate the fact that we have neo-colonialism now, and that's what the United States is doing in Iraq. In other words, we now dominate by means of economics. After the British, ended their colonization of most of the eastern part of the world, the major occupations were economic, multinational corporations, the World Bank, all of that. But back to my own story, I went to Palestine the first time in 1985 just as a tourist and with some friends because my parents didn't want me to go as part of that abroad program in '82. It was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Sabra and Shatila, a lot of horrific things happening in the Middle East at the time. But I went in 1985 searching for, say, possibly religious answers and ended up getting immersed in the Palestinian quest for, national self-determination by staying in the old city of Jerusalem for 6 months. And I had an apartment up on the Mount of Olives overlooking the Garden of Gethsemane. Oh, yeah. And, just was lucky to meet some Palestinian people, took us to all the villages that had been destroyed by Israel, took us to the Gaza Strip, ended up on a 6-day closure down in the Gaza Strip, and this was in '85, before Hamas even came to be. So I saw the situation, the daily closures, the daily harassments of the people, the total apartheid system that discriminates against the Palestinians in their everyday daily lives. And then coming back to the United States and hearing on the evening news that the classification of Palestinians as terrorists. And it just floored me because I said, my God, we have to do something about this. And I thought I'd come back and tell all of the United States about how horrible the Palestinians are being treated and what an injustice it was, and that they'd actually care. And when I got back, I found that nobody really cared. So I started to embark on human rights struggles and looking for organizations that wanted to raise the awareness of, the plight of the Palestinian people.
The plight of the Palestinian people in particular, or did you have a feeling for the plight of the disadvantaged in other parts of the world, but particular focus on the Palestinians?
Of course, I felt for the disadvantage of the world, but I really had more of a focus on the Palestinian people because of the fact that, I came back with the feeling that the United States is directly responsible for their plight by way of the fact that they give, at the time, $4 billion a year, and now it's increased to about $6 billion, specifically for military aid that funds the occupation. So I felt that, well, and even Israelis would say, if it weren't for the United States money that we get, this occupation would not be able to sustain itself. Still today.
They would say that?
Even Israelis who were in support of that would say that. The Israeli economy would fold in 1 month, and they would be unable to sustain the occupation if the United States did not give aid and money and lip service and distorted media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I embarked on this, on this adventure, on this mission.
So the Zionist cause was really supported and was not able to be realized without strong support from the United States of America.
Correct.
That the people who have an interest in that ideology have been able to make part of our assumption of national interest and national direction to an inordinate degree compared to other claims made by nationalist causes that haven't been able to get such a strong support from the United States government and the people that are responsible for our system.
Sure.
Inordinately so.
Sure.
Israel's the largest, they get the most support in terms of aid than any other country.
Yes, they get the largest aid package.
And their influence is inordinately strong in terms of influencing Congress and our government and our system and so forth.
Sure, by the lobby, the AIPAC lobby, and the pro-Israel lobbies are very, very strong. But of course, Palestine's changed, even in mainstream U.S. media. The image of Palestine has changed, and through the years, I've seen an evolution of actually. Years ago in '86, when I first came back, Palestine would not be mentioned. The place itself would not be mentioned. Now at least the Palestinian people are spoken about that they have a place, a state, even a nation, even if it's not a state. And there's a Palestinian government, and that's acknowledged. And so the viewpoint is not as negative as it was. The Palestinians in '86 were just portrayed as airplane hijacking terrorists, even though the United States always had backdoor relations with the PLO and always tried to kind of, help facilitate bringing the PLO and the Israelis together to the negotiating table.
I wonder if we could back off what I said, because if you looked at the Second World War, after the Second World, the zeitgeist, or the feeling, after, again, I guess it started with Columbus, in a sense. 500 years ago, this European expansion, they've gone all over the world. And then after the Second World War, the British returned from the Raj in India. They backed out. The countries came out of Africa. Independence movement was coming. We had to start a UN in order to accommodate the newly independent countries that had been colonized by the Western powers. We fought a war in Vietnam that was a nationalist thing that we misidentified and were responsible in the end for about 4 million Southeast Asians that were killed. We had a horrible battle in France, in Algeria, against the French, and that sort of thing. But the only example of there be, if you were to go to Al Jazeera, I've done that, or you have, I'm sure, the major cause of upset on the part of those on that side of things, the other side of the one that we normally get in our news and so forth, you'll see it just overwhelmingly from Iran and so forth. The one thing that the people who had that boot on their necks for so long, the major thing that they see is a Western imperialistic colonization that they had just got out from under the boot of. And that's the major thing that they object to in terms of the overriding influence of the United States. And then also they see that as characteristic. They don't see it as a Jewish something or other. They see it as a European imposition of a colonial power with all of the attitudes that are attended upon the Western colonization, the white man's burden, all that sort of thing. That's the way they see it, and yet we never seem to get that in the news accounts of how we are. If we want to try and understand it from their perspective, we should try and incorporate that into our thinking more than we have. And the only example that went counter to that, if I'm right, or maybe I'm wrong, you've got a history.
This is
the only example that went counter to that tendency was the Zionist incursion into Palestine in the name of a nationalistic movement of the Jewish people, but the Arab people see that as Western colonialism, imposition of white men's burden. People are going to live above and beyond their Ubermenschen over the locals and that kind of thing. And they have, am I off base on that?
Well, that's what I basically focus my course on. I basically focus it that, in other words, you know, the U.S. media needs to not take current recent events as a snapshot in history, that this has a whole legacy, a historical legacy behind it, a historical legacy of colonialism, which, as you said, really the people there see Zionism as an extension of that colonial legacy. And, you know, as a supporter of, you know, the major powers' regional or geopolitical interests in the area. And even Zionists will categorize it in that way. So that, in other words, what I say to my students is you cannot look at these events that are happening around us today, especially in the Middle East, as a snapshot in history. It's not in a vacuum. It has a whole historical legacy, and you have to understand that history in order to be able to make sense of what's happening today and why, quote unquote, they hate us.
Right.
Because that's not actually even true.
That represents a good deal of the world population. I mean, they had a thing when they did the 9/11, there was a report out of China among the masses of the people in China, even some of the people in the party, who said that they thought that was a good, just thing, that the United States was getting, and the West, was getting their just deserts for the opium wars and the kind of things that were imposed by Western imperialism on the Chinese and from the, you know, that kind of thing. So it'd be good to be sensitive to that, it seems to me, more than we seem to be, because we think it just comes out of whole cloth. But why is it that the Israeli example, what differentiates Zionism as a neo-colonial thing? They have a narrative that goes back 1,000 years. They have a story. The French.
I would qualify that.
Okay.
They really don't have a narrative. They have a historical narrative that goes back for thousands of years, but they only have a national narrative that really goes back to the 19th century. In fact, it was impossible to look at Zionism in national terms before. Not only before Herzl, actually before, you know, German nationalism. I mean, it's a
nationalism is a new thing. French Revolution.
Well, it's more of a model of German nationalism. This idea that there's a master race, the idea that there's a racially, ethnically, religiously oriented justification for a nation state. Okay, and that was impossible that was impossible to envision or impossible to internalize before the era of, 19th century nationalism and before these ethnographic, racial ethnic nationalisms came to be to the fore with German nationalism.
Yeah.
So, this is actually a very new narrative, but as far as, why, how and why the Zionists were able to, do that.
Pull it off.
Pull it off. There's a lot of things that go into that, but the fact that this served the interests of the British and then the United States afterwards in a very geopolitical, regional, strategic way is what we really have to anchor ourselves in.
Well, nationalism sort of followed, I think of it as after, you had the dynastic states in Europe for a long time, which was a different proposition than the nation state that came with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Scottish Enlightenment, that kind of thing, the Industrial Revolution. Nationalism is a way of getting political identity outside of the nation, the dynastic nation-state loyalties, each of which had formed a sort of Angevin regime that had held for 700 years. And then the times changed, the zeitgeist changed, and nationalism emerged as the principal means of political organization of peoples based on common identities.
Correct. And
so
then the
not
nation
just
state.
19th century, it goes back.
Well, it goes back a little further to the 18th and the 17th. You're right, the fall of the dynasties, but a few different versions of nationalism emerged. And what I'm saying is that the French Revolution, which threw out the idea that, a nation could be formed on the will of its people and a national culture, it doesn't really matter where you came from before or what your race was or your religion. The Zionist version of nationalism, which came out of the Zionist movement, and might not have been exactly what Theodore Herzl was striving for anyway, was this idea that, the Jews are a people and therefore they deserve a nation and they need, in other words, but this is based on religion and on language and, even the revival of the Hebrew language as, and that, that there's this glorious historical moment that was lost and, they have to reclaim their land, but that only Jews can be in that land.
Yeah, well, that's
and
part
that's
of...
the big mistake of
that was
Israel.
part of their narrative, that they were able to, in a certain sense, work PR to get that accepted within a context in which geopolitically they were able to change the facts on the ground and get the power, political, military power, to assert that claim, but they were able to do it. But there was a narrative in support of the colonization of Algeria by the French. There was one for the British and the Russians. There were a lot of satraps. There were a lot of people who signed on with the colonial masters, got along with them, got some advantages, and that worked with them and that kind of thing in the past and so forth. There was all of that. But somehow, in the post-Second World War, the only example where there was outright, not neo-colonial, not neoliberalism or something, that just, economic values and so forth, but outright colonial reassertion by Europeans of a people imposing upon a particular place. The only example that went that way directly against the tide of the history was, it seems to me, was the Zionist imposition of what had been Palestine. And what was there that differentiates it from the other causes? The French claim to Algeria, the French claim to Indochina, or any of the British claims to the Raj and so forth. What set the Zionist claim to asserting outright nationalist control, separate from the rest of the claims that the people were backing off from in terms of European white man burden, imposition of outright colonial rule, and the right to assert that? What distinguishes it to where we are so aligned with that in the United States? We vote only two people often at the UN. We're so aligned and we're so wrapped up in that.
I mean, I think a lot of
in terms of our own identity in the United States of America. And why is that? What's made that possible, do you think? Or could you understand, or could you explain it to make some sense out of it? And what's the future of that claim by the Zionists that do represent in a large measure the neocons who've sort of taken over our government?
Well, I think that, first of all, all of those countries that were colonized, the British and the French and the imperialists of the time, the empires of the time, realized that their days have come to an end, and they actually did recognize in some way the futility of trying to, occupy these territories and to colonize these territories.
With this one exception of Zionism.
Well, wait. So colonization was on its way out.
Yes.
Okay? And they knew that the era of decolonization, these people, the non-Western people, have internalized the texts about self-determination and about nationalism.
For their own nationalism.
Right. And the British saw that, in other words, the British mostly, and the
Wake
French
up
saw
and
that
smell the coffee. That's the zeitgeist
their
required.
reign was on the way out. Okay. But the Zionists, it was a different question because, in other words, you know, this was a nationalist question based on an idea of, you know, well, you know, the Jews are a people and we have some historical memories. We have some historical attachments to that land. Well, the British and the French never had any historical attachment to Algeria or
No, but they
Northern
would dream up things, or they would conjure things in literature, and they would try to make claims and that kind of thing.
But they recognized that their reign was colonial and that their reign was one of occupation and of taking resources and this and that, and they knew their days were over. They knew they couldn't sustain that.
Okay, so
but
the British and the French didn't have that claim, let's say, in North America. We could do that with the Ojibwe Indian peoples and so forth. But there was an overwhelming power on the part of the European into the Americas that made it irreversible, or maybe that'll be questioned at some point by Aboriginal peoples around the world. But in the case of Israel, it was running. I mean, there were facts on the ground. And so that Zionism was a legitimate claim based upon historical narratives going back to King David and so forth.
I mean, it was sold that way. Yeah.
It was sold that way.
Not only that, I mean, we can't be insensitive to the fact that, you know, the Jews were a persecuted people and they were discriminated against in Europe, you know, to a large degree. And I mean, there were a couple of schools of thought there. One of the schools of thought was that after the era of emancipation and when, you know, in other words, when secularization came about and Jews started to make contributions to those European societies and, you know, and whatnot, there were two schools of thought. One was, let's assimilate, and let's, you know, and many Jews converted. They converted to Christianity to be accepted,
they didn't have to convert. They could not only convert, they were used to read the Talmud 12 hours a day or something with great respect for scholarship and so forth. But then they also went into things like medicine and education and all kinds of intellectual explosions that accommodated their getting out. Israel Shaik would say.
That they thought would accommodate their assimilation. But then after things like the Dreyfus Affair and many other, you know, events that convinced some Jews that, you know what, no matter what we do, even if we can convert to Christianity, we're never going to be accepted.
Yeah,
okay,
never.
So that was one part.
That anti-Semitism is built into the DNA of the human society.
Correct.
And that there's just no way to deal with it. It was very deep. There's a lot of people, like of the Negro persuasion, who feel that that's built into the population of the world, racism. And they have a thing on that. But they haven't been able to make such a strong claim in any kind of a way, the way the Jewish people were. And there's been a lot of persecution in the history of the world. The Armenians were persecuted. That was a Holocaust. But they've got it to where the Holocaust is the one and only Holocaust of the people who suffered.
There are many Holocausts.
But there were 25 million Russians were killed in that war and that sort of thing. But they were able to build a narrative, and that's what it is. It's a story or something, and they've been very, very successful.
They've been very successful.
But is it been oversold, and is it now, we've got Hamas, and now we got the president of Iran who's saying, yes, we're going to make atomic bombs. Or we're going to do atomic weapons. We should be able to develop and so forth. They bombed that atomic reactor in Iraq.
In Iraq in 1981.
They felt that they had the ability to do that. There was Nita Renfrew says that they one time blocked a shipment of pencils under the name of dual-use technology.
Oh, I mean, it's ridiculous.
Because the pencils could be ground down and made into a bomb. So if you've got the dual-use notion of what these people should be barefoot, pregnant, and in the background, and never able to develop it because they might become a threat to us. The Ubermenschen of the world, and in the case of the Middle East, were the Jewish Zionists there. And do you understand that they've been able to sell that in the world?
But Harold, let me just stop you for 1 minute. What we also have to remember, though, is that in terms of things like nuclear weapons, Israel and the United States are two of, I believe it's the 3 countries that have not signed on to the nuclear non-proliferation treaties.
Correct.
And the non-aligned movements and whatnot. And so, in other words, I think it's, again, this Western superiority complex that says we can have nuclear weapons and you can't.
It used to be
who has basically perpetrated much more, you know, terror and much more use of these types of weapons on populations.
There was a city called Hiroshima.
Nagasaki. Yes.
There was a city called Nagasaki.
Yeah, Vietnam.
And that was done in napalm and Agent Orange and depleted the uranium now and that kind of thing. Well, that was what that's what my granddaddy was a general officer. And he was a general officer at Kandahar in the 19th century in the Indian Service. He won a Victoria Cross. Yeah. But he converted with Frank Buckman and Gandhi to peace.
And
but they had, that's what the British used to say, Egad, Brigadier, it looks like the Wogs have got advantage. They now have a Gatling gun.
Yeah,
They cannot allow the Wogs to have a Gatling gun. They had this overriding, super overriding idea that the white race, the white man's burden, was very strong in the 19th century and so forth, that we were civilized, we were going to bring civilization to the, and it's still there.
By any means necessary.
And it's still there.
Right. They were going to impose civilization on these people by any means necessary.
That's right. And that's the way the Palestinians see the Jewish intrusion into Palestine, whereas we never hear that or get that take on things in the United States because... Well, but that's what the world sees it.
That's what the world...
And it'd be good for us to see it the way the world sees it, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Okay.
And I also, though, think that, you know, this whole idea about seeing history and, you know, seeing the events in a snapshot is very, very valid because, in other words, you know, the idea that, you know, well, the Palestinians, always we turn the criminals around to be the victims and the victims around to be the criminals. So when the Palestinians... Scapegoating. When the Palestinians fight back, using any means necessary, that's what we see in the Western media. And that was the real problem that I had. And I went back into history and I said, well, let me really study about what happened between 1917, say, or between maybe 1897, the first, you know, Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland.
It was in Switzerland.
In Switzerland in 1897.
Wasn't Herzl out of Russia, though, or is he Swiss? He was Swiss, I'm not sure.
No, he wasn't
Why
Swiss.
do I associate him with Russia?
I thought he was German. I'm not
okay,
sure.
maybe,
anyway.
yeah, okay.
No. Anyway, but in other words, from that time
he was an atheist.
I'm not sure.
I think he was.
But anyway, the point is, though, that from 1897 on, when Jews first started moving back to Palestine and settling in Palestine, right? In other words, you know, there's this discourse, there's this ongoing thing where, you know, you settle there because you want to go, the idea that you want to go back to your homeland, right? But was it necessarily a question of having a state, okay? Some would say, well, you know, the early Zionists wanted to boycott Arab labor and they wanted to impose, you know, make this an exclusively Jewish state. And what I did was I studied that period and I said, well, what happened between, you know, say 1897 and 1945 or 46 that really kind of set the mood, and how could things have been different, okay? Now, many early Jewish settlers went as part of a socialist dream, right? To just settle, to be...
Ben-Gurion was social,
Ben-Gurion became a nationalist, you know, and he became actually a terrorist
Well, you could be a nationalist and a socialist at the same time.
Okay, well, but anyway, the point is, though, that many of the early settlers wanted to specifically do that, to settle in Palestine and to live there. Did they necessarily want an exclusively Jewish state? Maybe not. Not all of them, not necessarily. And the question would have been back then to develop some sort of, to say, okay, well, Jews can settle here and let's ask, you know, let's ask the indigenous inhabitants of this land, can we do this if we're not going to disrupt their place, okay? And if they would have tried to do what they could to develop a democratic state for all of those who lived there, we would have never had the scenario that we had.
Well, I think Jabotinsky recognized if you're going to come in and take their land, you're going to get a reaction. You're not going to be able to do it all with roses and sweet talk.
Right, and not only
you're going to have to crack a lot of heads and be realistic. In a realistic world that's going to attack us, we're not going to stand weak and watch our people go into oppression. We are going to stand tall in the name of realpolitik, and we got the power to do it, so we will.
And I think the sad thing really is that if they weren't, you know, in other words, if they weren't shoving Jews into concentration camps and everything else, I don't think there would have been this massive exodus and this massive underground
Probably
movement.
not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at even the Jewish underground in countries like Russia and Germany and whatnot, they did not know at the time the history of Palestine. They were not thinking we're going to unseat these Palestinians. They were thinking, my God, we're going to run for our lives and go wherever we can.
Right.
Israel, United States and Britain basically closed the door to a lot of Jews. And, you know, in a lot of the
that was probably a mistake.
Oh, I think it was a big mistake.
Big mistake. We should have let them come here.
Of course.
Yeah, or somewhere, rather than... why wonder why we were so short-sighted in that.
Well, there's speculation.
You've done the history, so why were we, the Western powers, so short-sighted in the face of the absurdity of the Nazi agenda? So short-sighted in terms of saying, for crying out loud, let's open the gateways and let them come to America.
I think there was a couple of reasons.
And was there any blockage of going to America by the Zionists?
Well, that's part of it, of course. I mean,
Lenny Brenner's got that book out documenting the collaboration of the Zionists in the 1930s and the Nazis.
With the Nazis,
and the Zionist flag was flying in Nazi Germany. because they had a common interest.
They had a dual interest, and it
The
would have
Germans
worked.
wanted the
Rid
the Jews out,
Correct.
and the Zionists want the Jews in Palestine.
Correct, and it
for
went,
geopolitical reasons that they understood.
Now, I think the Zionist push is a little bit overstated in that case, though, because I think that there were a lot of, I think that unfortunately U.S. policy is often short-sighted until it's almost too late. And I think that U.S. policy and even British policy was very short-sighted, not realizing or knowing, but pushing it away from lack of willingness to want to enter the war. Okay,
You mean,
so I think
are you talking now about 1947?
Yeah,
and
I'm talking
and the
about
whole thing?
1945,
Mr. Truman
1944.
and 45, yeah.
You know, I'm talking about early on. I think
Oh,
the
in terms of not
short-sightedness.
opening the gate to the oppressed of the...
To
There were
those
a lot of
oppressed Jews running.
displaced people in war-torn Europe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the reality in terms of being able to open up? We had displaced people, we had care packages to Britain, we had all Greece. It was a terrible condition in Greece.
So much.
There was that, so they weren't able, nations aren't able to just open the floodgates for people that are in bad shape.
Correct. I also,
You know,
though,
trying to get the reality.
well, I
on
also
that.
think in the Jewish case, though, I think that, I think that the Zionist movement did have a lot to do with that because, they really did want people to go to Palestine. They really, they started, especially towards 44 and 45. I mean, now you have well-entrenched camps of, certain factions of Zionism which were running, and some of them were illegal. The Stern Gang, the Zvailumi, the Haganah, all of these groups that, Menachem Begin and David Ben-Gurion were members of, pushing this, oh, you must close your borders because we want all of the Jews to come here, okay? And they saw that as a fight to challenge, British immigration policy,
Make
which was
Aliyah.
right, which was constrained at the time, by Arab opinion, right? So in other words, I think that it was forced, and I mean there is, evidence that boats were turned away from the United States. They've gone back to Germany, and the people were slaughtered as a, to go back to die in the concentration camps and whatnot.
That would get your dander up, as they say, if you were of the Jewish persuasion.
Sure,
and you have to watch
yeah,
that and suffer that so you can understand it. But it was Europeans who did that by and large.
Yeah, but I also
so
think
why
that
were they not able to? The president of Iran just said, why don't they give a part of Europe to the displaced Jews?
Right, right. Well, and and that's true.
He said it was they who did the oppression, not the Arabs.
Correct, and
so they
that's
came
the
out
sad thing.
Yeah.
You
know what I'm saying?
I
and
think
that's an
the sad
attitude
thing.
that is, how widespread is that attitude of real deep animus against the Zionist entity, as they call it, in the Arab world,
Oh my
if
God.
they
Well,
were
it's
not
very
being bribed and if they were not being intimidated and they're not being beaten down and not being told that if they don't understand and recognize that above all else, then they are going to have great disadvantage delivered down on them, the powers that be. If the Arab street, if they say, or the Islamic street were able to say, what would be their real attitude, and what do you think their attitude is toward Hamas now emerging, and also with a militancy in terms of that question, and also the broader Islamic world, including Iran, and you got 1.4 billion, unlike the Ojibwe, who only had a couple of thousand against millions of Europeans coming to the Americas. It might be that if they really get a united attitude toward Israel as a colonial enterprise by overlord, Western imperialistic colonial overlord kind of thing and everything, they could put pressure on Israel that would be irrefutably the same way they forced France out of Iraq, out of Algiers, they forced out of, the British were forced out of India, the French were forced out of Indochina, and the idea is that they're going to put real serious pressure upon the arrogance of the Zionist claims to that, and that may in turn also be that the people of the world, the masses of the world, are going to be seemingly against all odds that they're going to be able to challenge the overriding arrogance of the American colonial masters who are running neoliberal patterns and so forth, that they're going to be able to, the people of the world, the masses, are going to be able to challenge the rulers of the world now who are seen by a great number of the people of the world as not serving the interests of the masses. Could it be part of a movement that could lead toward a real mass movement based among the masses of the people against the inappropriate patterns by which the Anja regime is running this planet that is as outdated as Louis XVI was in 1789 to what the planet needs in order to liberate humanity or something? Can you see a big movement toward liberation from the inappropriate way in which this planet's being operated now coming out of this, or is that stretching way too far?
I mean, I think that, you know, there's definitely power in the masses, and I think that there's power in public opinion, okay? But I think that, you know, in the you know, the neo-colonialist world that we live in, that's run basically by, you know, international capitalism and multinational corporations, I think that, you know, it's stretching a bit to say that the masses actually are ever going to be united. Are they going to get pissed off enough where they, you know, demand an end to U.S. imperialism? Sure.
You think so?
Well, people will
When?
be out. Wait. I think they're there now.
You think so?
I think that people are out in the streets in mass, you know, in Latin America, in the Middle East, everywhere.
Ineffectually.
But wait a minute, the problem is this. The problem is not the people. The problem is the relationships that many of these conservative monarchies, especially in the Middle East, and many of these conservative regimes have with the United States.
Yeah, well,
right?
the United States is
in
a
other words,
conservative regime.
well, and not only that, I mean, you know, the United States relationships with many of these countries actually hinders the prospects for democracy rather than fostering.
They're like satraps in the old colonial thing. Yeah?
And, you know, in other words, so this whole question that George Bush and, you know, Donald Rumsfeld
Talking about democracy.
and this junta, which they try to sell themselves off as an administration, portrays about spreading democracy in the Middle East can be contradicted within 3 seconds flat by looking at the relationships and the regimes that they support.
Yeah.
And this is going to hinder the power of the masses, okay?
Well, sure.
This is
understood.
And this absolutely
understood,
does.
darling. But in
You
in 1789, the thing in order by which people got their identity was the dynastic state.
Correct.
It had held for 700 years. Everybody thought that was legitimate. That's the way in way you get a relationship to the, you know, that kind of thing. And it was outdated. The system that's in place now that they claim is legitimate in a historical sense is out of touch. That is the United States, the International Monetary Fund, the running dogs, who satraps who go along with them, get bribed and all that kind of thing. The war in Iraq, they are out of date as a system. They walk the world with great big league boots, and they have to be. And there is the zeitgeist requires an alternative that the times have determined. Just as in 1789 there was an industrial revolution coming that could not be denied.
There has to be,
and that maybe that will be happening now.
Well, I think you're right, Harold. I think there has to be a world revolution.
Yes. Yes. Where is it going to start?
The powers that
Where?
be.
Where will it
And,
start?
you know, and hopefully it would start with an attack on U.S. imperialism
Yes.
and world imperialism, and then possibly even result in some sort of, you know, in seeing the demise of international capitalism as we know it. And
well, okay, or fundamental alteration,
you know?
and a cat's paw thing is maybe the Israeli one is where there's particular pressure able to be brought. They got a wall. Is somebody going to say, Mr. Netanyahu, tear down that wall?
Well,
they
Mr.
got these things, they're developing apartheid, and that makes them, that the idea, what I'm saying is, and it maybe is never voiced, can't be voiced for some reason, I don't know, that the idea of Zionism may have been a big mistake.
It has to be addressed.
It was a mistake.
It has to be addressed.
It has to be a mistake.
It absolutely has to be addressed.
Now that can never be brought up in the media in this country, and it's thought of as almost like sacrosanct.
Yes.
The Israel stands different than all the other colonial expressions.
Correct.
And what's the difference?
Well, that's the
in your
problem.
view?
Like you said, the only difference I see is that they've been able to successfully sell the Zionist, you know, the Zionist claims as legitimate by sticking to the
Public
idea
relations?
That, well, not only public relations, by sticking to the idea that, well, the Jews are a people, they're a distinct people with a distinct religion, and they deserve to have this nation state, and that the fact that, you know, in other words, because of these historical claims, like there's a Zionist teacher that was teaching, you know, in my college, and basically he said, well, it's the Palestinians' fault because they didn't accept that the partition plan, and they didn't accept that the Jews had national rights.
You mean the Barak thing?
Up until now, no, 1947.
I see.
November 29, 1947.
Right.
He says, you know, since the Arabs did not accept
Yeah.
partition, and you know, in all reality, who's going to accept partition of their homeland? Okay, but you know, this is what they claim. They didn't recognize the fact or the idea that Jews have national rights. But to me, I've never been convinced that Jews have national rights because, in other words, how, you know, you have historical
Well, they'll
claims,
say, well, everybody else has national rights, why shouldn't we?
No,
They'll
actually,
say.
Right,
Yeah.
but you come from somewhere else, and, you know, but most of those national rights were taken by conquest, and
Yeah,
we recognize
right.
this,
So they've
okay?
got the power to
So
do it.
they say, you know, really might breeds right.
Right.
Okay?
Well,
And,
that's
you know,
realpolitik.
That's realpolitik.
That's
Machiavelli
realpolitik. That's
in the
yeah,
modern age.
right. That's what runs the world. Yeah.
Yeah. This is what. But is that legitimate in terms of, you know, in terms of if you want to have, you know, national rights? Well, you know, I'm not convinced that you can have national rights by conquest, but I am convinced that the indigenous people who have lived there and have, legitimate national rights that will ever be recognized.
Well, legitimate is, right, in terms of geopolitical terms, that's the legitimacy of international law. But in terms of the sweep of history, like it could be that there were the Aboriginal people of North America didn't have the ability to fight against the Europeans. It was hopeless.
But let's,
you couldn't fight against tanks and stuff. It was overwhelmingly hopeless. So that's a thing that just overrode. I mean, there was no way of that. But in the case of the few people who've taken the case of Israel on, I mean, it's a different proposition. You got 1.4. You got 1.4 billion Muslims, not a few people, savages in the New World, where you can superimpose your thing on them.
Well, and what you
but there's going to be a reaction to it.
And what you have to think too is this. I mean, now we see Hamas come to power, and people in the United States and in the West seem to be, interpreting this as a religious victory. Okay, more than it really is. Okay, but we'll touch on that. But let's just touch on the idea of, okay, 1.4 billion Muslims as opposed to I don't know how many million Jews. Now the Jews claim themselves
14 million or something
like
in the world.
Okay, now the Jews claim that they're a people based on their religion. So really, Israel, in my book, is a secular theocracy, if that makes any sense. Okay, they say they're a secular state, but they're really a theocracy because if you're basing the basis for your state on the fact on your religion. Now let's say if the Muslims did that. Okay, and they said, well, we're allowed to. There are 3 Islamic states in the world, right? And the West is not. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran.
Oh, okay.
Right? Okay. Now, the West does not look upon these very favorably. I mean, they don't think that theocracies are the best way in the modern age to be approaching, questions of nationhood. So, in other words, I think we really have to take a look at that paradigm and say, well, where is the real justification for Israel to be an exclusively Jewish state, okay? And even the Zionist interpretation in the discourse has really changed because people have moved forward. So no longer is the idea that, Israel as a state should be destroyed. Even Hamas. I mean, recently Hamas has basically stated that they would be happy with this two-state solution where they got East Jerusalem as their capital and they were able to have an army and to defend the borders. So even the religious people are not claiming those sorts of particularist, state formations anymore. And even the idea of Zionism, I mean, there are people, progressive people in both camps that would look and say, well, you know what, a binational state which encompasses and which directs, which extends rights to all the people of the area, not only the Jews, is a foreseeable paradigm. It's definitely, it's something that could be worked towards, okay? Now, if you want to talk about Hamas's view of the end to Israel, as a state, they've never specifically said that. Their charter does say something about returning to the land of Palestine, which was conquered in 1948. And would a new paradigm for Palestine mean the end of Israel as an exclusively Jewish state? Well, that might be a possibility. Does that mean Jews have to be thrown into the sea? No, not necessarily at all. I mean, the rhetoric and the sort of discourse amongst Palestinians now is, we know Israel's not going away. We don't want the Jews to be thrown into the sea. We want to have them as part of a state. Okay, we want to have them as part of a state, but we don't want them to have dominion over us. We don't want them to have their feet upon our necks, and we want to have something that, a state that would not look like simply a specifically exclusively Jewish state or a specifically exclusively Palestinian state. No. Okay, well, something that would extend democratic rights. The ideal version would be a social democratic state for all the residents that live there. And I think that's really the paradigm. The implications that the Hamas victory has for, say, the rest of the world in terms of the rise of Islam, that's a question that we might want to address as well. Okay, and I don't know if you want me to go there. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think
it's right in the news right now. Well, they just won overwhelming election in Palestine.
Correct, and I mean, there's a lot of political implications with this, and those political...
And you got those things going on in Iran with that new president.
Right, and I mean, the political implications are all over the globe for, the rise of, I don't want to say, I don't believe it's for fundamentalist Islam, like they say in the mainstream U.S. media, but I do believe that the rise of Islam throughout the world and Islamic governments and even societies going more Islamic have really been a direct effect of Western policy toward the region, okay? It's number one, it's an attempt to reassert an identity, okay, because the overwhelming majority of the people in those places are Muslim, even if they're secular Muslims. I mean, most people, I would say 99% of the people in, you know, say Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, they're secular Muslims. They're not fundamentalists, okay? You know, but U.S. invasions, the U.S. occupation of Iraq, U.S. biased policy, you know, in favor of Israel, and all of this has really, and even more recently, the U.S. and the EU's stance on Hamas, threatening to get rid of, you know, to withhold aid, is just going to throw Hamas basically into the arms of, you know, of looking to their Islamic sources for aid. You know, in one way, it might even be positive, because, you know, if Hamas doesn't have to go to, if
they don't have to go begging ban to the United States or
and
something.
meet the conditions that the U.S. and that the
and they're
European
serving
Union
the people.
imposes upon
They're
them.
putting meals on
Correct.
the table. They're taking care of people, getting things done. Yeah. And that's one lot of the reason why they're being so supported. And so, but what you're saying is, it seems to me, there were people who said that. What happened to the French colonial overlords in Algeria?
Well, they went away.
I mean, there was talk about how we can all get together. We can all be together. You got these overlords and that kind of stuff, but the colonial expression was, you know, we can assimilate with them. But there was a nationalist thing, and the reason that or under the Raj, they were doing that. People would get along. There's no point in fighting these British. We got to get along with them. They're here. We got to get along and everything. But then there was finally, in the end, there was a thing where the nationalism in true dimension came out.
Correct.
Rather than collaborating with the people who put the boot on them, supposedly bringing them out.
Get them out.
So you're saying that they're going to be able to get together, but the real sentiment that they have, having had their houses bulldozers, people killed,
the third
is to get them out and back to Europe.
Well, to get
That's
them,
what they did with the French. Why not? Why would that not be able to assert itself? And then it begins to make you wonder, because you've got that country has a couple hundred, and they're so tied into this ideology of Zionism. This country is so tied into it. Well, you can never get elected to Congress unless you're able to sing the praises of Israel.
But how?
Understand? But now they got 200 atomic bombs.
But there's a lot of
It's a very worrying thing.
It's a very worrying thing. But the thing is that if we want to, you know, clarify, let's clarify first of all two things. There really are essentially right now two states there. Okay, modern Palestinian discourse does recognize. Well, it doesn't necessarily recognize Israel's right to have stolen the Palestinian land from the Palestinian people. It recognizes that Israel is a reality and it's not going away anytime soon. Okay?
Well,
so
are you sure?
Overwhelmingly,
in their heart of hearts.
In their heart of hearts, they're not only just
but they're only just accepting that as a geopolitical necessity because the boot of power is on their neck.
But I think what they'd like to see,
and that if they had their say, they would want to have a one-state Palestinian, and that's where their heart is.
Of course.
And that's a nationalist thing that may assert itself in great dimension that would force that. Why not?
But it's not a question right now. Because,
why?
Well, because the main question right now still remains...
Who's got all the Apache helicopters?
No. Well, but ending the occupation. It still remains the geopolitical reality of ending the occupation, okay? And it still is the reality of, in other words, let's get Palestine that was promised to us. In fact, as late as 1994, Hamas actually de facto recognized Israel within 1948 borders and said, we really want the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem as our Palestinian state. Okay, what do we want more after that? Well, if we look at the Israeli sort of the Zionist expansionist aims, which says that they want everything from the Nile River to the Euphrates, and from the river to the sea.
The greater Israel.
Would we want to expand? Yeah, of course we want to expand. Is that a reality? Our reality right now, no. Our reality is to get our Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, to get the Apache helicopters out of the sky, to get the Israeli soldiers out of our streets, and you saw that in Gaza, to open the borders, to have commerce, to have trade, to be seen as a legitimate partner. Now, what happens from there, who knows? Because that alone has not been achieved, and it's going to be very tough to achieve even that part.
Okay, now if you were to extend that metaphor further in the world, because Israel is an extension of the United States, and the United States is the major power in the world, and the United States is walking this country with great big league boots, thinking it has a legitimate role. It represents historical legitimacy. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, The End of History. We defeated all those socialist nonsense in the Soviet Union. We're in control. We have a system for the ages. Everything's in control. The world has only to sing our tune. We've got bases in 130 countries. We are legitimate in a historical sense. International Monetary Fund and all these neoliberal things. We represent legitimate movement of history. And the question is that ever, in any kind of a way, as it would seem to me it might have to be in terms of the zeitgeist, going to be at a fundamental level challenged by the masses of the world or by a movement of the masses of the world that do not want to be under the yoke of Western imperialist ideas, uber-mentioned kind of racist ideas and so forth, that is the lot of the vast majority of the people of this world, because that system in place serves only the top few plutocrats that work as satraps to these people. And are we going to have to just suffer that they have a system because of their power? We're going to have to get down and never be able to have an answer to that. And is that what's in the, is that what it is? You accept the power because they got the boot on your throat.
That's all.
That's what I'm saying,
well,
and that Israel is an extension of that.
But they know that I don't think that they accept it, and I do think
Who doesn't?
I don't think that the majority of the people in the world,
in their heart of hearts, they accept it as a necessity because geopolitical power. They've got the Gatling guns, they got all the power, they got the boot on our throat. We'd better accept it, but they're not accepting it because they're thinking for an alternative, and they may have a challenge because the times call for a challenge, because that system is as outdated as Louis XVI was in 1789, and those people in power don't realize it's outdated. And one aspect of that is this little group of people in Israel is an extension of the United States power in terms of geopolitical and public opinion. That's what I'm saying. Will there be a challenge?
But I think they recognize that, but I don't think that that's the challenge right now, because I think that there are more immediate challenges to be faced. I mean, there's the daily life of the Palestinians. There's no economy. There's no jobs. There's 1.4 million Palestinians now in Gaza, which is basically a big prison.
Well, it's one of the means of exerting control by the powerful over the weak.
There are, you know, in other words, but I think that the daily lives, the improvement of the daily lives of the people, their access to goods and services, their desire to build an economy and a government and all of that, you know, I think that those are the more immediate concerns. I don't think, I mean, I think ultimately people would love to see the power brokers out of power. You know, and that may happen as an evolution. I believe that takes a world revolution, and maybe
well, is it blowing in the wind is what I'm saying.
Well, it possibly
in the things
could be,
we can see, rather than all the compromising, all the
compromising,
we're going to have to compromise to the people who have their boot on our throat. And they don't have a vision. They have no vision. That's relative to the future. Or do we have to accommodate to Louis XVI's idea of powdered wigs?
I don't think that that's what really
You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, but I don't think that those are the central questions right now.
Chinese have sold out. The communists have sold out to the capitalist model, that kind of thing.
Well, I think they all talk about this in the coffee shops and stuff, and I mean, idealistically and ideologically, I think that they read Marx and they believe that, you know, maybe a socialist revolution is on the offing.
Or some sort of a revolution.
But I think that their daily lives are just too difficult.
Is the system that it's in place one that's able to serve the interests of the masses of the world? I just saw a thing that the wealth of the United States, and it's a monitor economy, it went now to where 58% of all capital assets now are owned by the upper 1%, and it's just gone up. It's doubled over the last 20 years. And they just passed a tax cut, $2 trillion that went to the overwhelming. Everything's going to the top 1%. And the world does not have a system that serves the interests of the masses.
Well, I think that the...
You understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying.
And it's being accepted only because they have to accept it, because there's no alternative being offered by the intellectual.
But I think the Palestinians, as a very educated, very well-read group of people, know all that, and they've internalized all that. Oh, of course they do. Of course they do. You know, they're some of the most highly educated people in the world.
Yeah, that's
but
what I
the
understand.
problem is not this. The problem is that, you know, they're not going to address that right now. They're going to address right now the more immediate concerns that they have. I mean, until they're in the paradigm of the nation state, and until even that's why, you know, many of the factions have have signed on to the idea of the two-state solution. Because at least if we get our little state in part of Palestine, we'll have achieved something in the nation-state paradigm before that paradigm goes away. Okay? That paradigm may not be going away anytime soon, but they have to achieve, you know, it's baby steps. They have to achieve that. They have to achieve a functioning economy. They have to achieve a functioning government. You know, there are social questions which need to be answered. Okay. Now, in terms of Hamas, I mean, I have that. I have the tape with Raji Sourani, which talks about.
How long is it?
Yeah, it's a couple of minutes. I mean,
maybe we could run it quick. Can you set it up? Maybe we can. We got a couple. We only got 3 minutes left.
Oh my goodness!
We better not. We'll have to do it on another, well.
Oh, that's too bad, because I think
Yeah.
you really should incorporate
Okay,
it.
if
you
you
know?
got a tape, can you set it up and run that tape now, then a couple minutes of it anyway? And that's too bad. We should have set it up. Can you set it up and run that tape with Sarani? If not, then we may have to just talk ourselves out of this and come back to it on another occasion or something, because there it is. Is that it? Okay,
No,
let's
that's
see.
the video. Okay, but that's okay. Let's see what that is.
Well, we seem not to be able to.
Elections here
Is
have
this
been
it?
practiced in fantastic way, and pre-election monitoring showed in a clear-cut way that there was no grave breaches or breaches, serious ones, affected the will of the Palestinian people. And on the day of the election, I mean, things really, went in a fantastic way, and except minor violations here and there. But the overall scene was fantastic, and I think the whole world witnessed real Palestinian democracy, which is the first, to be in the Middle East. And of course, in democracy, there is a basic rule that we have to buy the product in advance, meaning that nobody can guarantee the results, but everyone should be committed to the results of the elections if it's fair and transparent. And that was the case. Hamas won, Bon appetit. They make it, and Hamas has been defeated, and they accepted this fact. So now Hamas formed a majority at the Legislative Council, and they should have on their shoulder the mission to form the new government for the PA.
Dr. Sarani, what do you...
Government, it's a major
Yeah,
thing. It's
yeah.
shaking everything up. And they're much more radically inclined than the PA and that kind of thing.
Well,
What do you think, it augurs well or what?
Well, I think that,
We got-
I wouldn't say they're much more radically inclined, because the Al-Aqsa brigades and the, Hamas have been, still believe in carrying out operations against the people that are occupying them in the occupied territories. But I think it's a less corrupt. If it's more theocratic, it's less corrupt. And
I
it really,
see.
as Raji Sarani, who we just had on, was
Yeah.
saying,
Now, he
it
is
really
what
was
again?
run. He's a human rights lawyer in the Gaza Center for
Okay,
Human Rights.
right.
He's a secularist.
All right,
but
all right.
He believes that Hamas, the whole question was that Hamas is a less corrupt. They're not corrupt at all. They provide services to the people.
Yeah, they do understand. Yeah.
Where Fatah
like
was,
the Panthers used to do.
and
Yeah.
where Fatah was falling apart. Okay,
Uh-huh.
will they impose more theocratic measures on the society? That has to be balanced out, and that has to be seen. And that, I believe, will be worked out amongst the umbrella of Palestinian organizations, which actually this plethora of Palestinian organizations will provide a semblance of democracy. So I don't think any one group can really, even if Hamas is dominating the whole legislature, doesn't mean that it can be against the wall. The other
Okay.
groups will have input, and that will,
Okay.
it remains to be seen how that will bear out.
To
in
be
society.
continued.
Yes,
Thank you. I'm sorry
okay.
we've run out
Thank
of
you.
time. Your pleasure to have the perceptions of Sharin.
Sharin.
Sharin Chiorazzo.
Chiorazzo. I can't even say my own last
You can't
name.
even say her own
Chiorazzo.
name. But she's a great, she's an expert WBAI. You got a program at
Yes.
BAI, professor.
Live
of,
from Palestine. yes.
Live from Palestine at
Yes.
BAI. Thanks a lot for coming in, Sharin. Your
Thank
pleasure
you.
to have her perceptions. We invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again tomorrow. And thank you, Sharin, very, very much
Thank
for
you,
everything.
Harold.
Drive safely home and so forth. And we'll have to continue this. You have to keep putting me in touch with people. But I see that fellow in Bolivia just won 54% of the vote. You got Chavez, you got all kinds of things going on in Latin
yeah.
America and else. I think the tide may be rising to where the whole basic premise is going to be able to be questioned, one of which is the legitimate